I'm sure I don't know all of you. I do know quite a few of you by sight and sometimes in some cases in person. So my thoughts, reflections, hopefully will cover both new territory for some perhaps and old territory for others. The beautiful thing about this tradition is that it's because it touches on certain universal truths, which are always true, then it doesn't matter how many times one hears something, it's always a good reminder to hear it again. This is, as you all know, a Theravada class, but I think it's helpful to remember that no tradition, no sub-tradition has a monopoly on truth. Even Buddhism itself as a whole doesn't have a monopoly on truth. All it does is point out certain salient features of existence. It offers injunctions and suggestions. But the beautiful thing about it, it's not a proselytizing religion. It is one that, at its core, both practices and encourages investigation, which means it's fundamentally an inquiry-based tradition. And as such, because it isn't theistic, doesn't rely on some external force or power, it isn't faith-based. Faith in the Buddhist context means something slightly different to what we know to be the faith that is required, almost essential for the book religions or the theistic religions. In the Buddhist tradition, faith is about trust. But trust has to be gained as well. So how do we gain trust? How do we get trust? We get trust by hearing what we hear and testing it out and finding out for ourselves if something is true or not true. And if it's not true or doesn't feel that it applies, then we can discard it or put it to one side and go back to it at a later date. But this core assumption that we, our minds, are inquiring into the nature of our existence, into the nature of our suffering, of our happiness, into the nature of experience, puts it really in a quite unique position, gives it a different platform to most religions. And as such, it becomes very philosophical. In other words, it's in search of wisdom, which is what the original word philosophy comes from, philos from wisdom. So it's an inquiry into truth. At the same time, I think it's helpful for lay people such as ourselves to remember, certainly Western lay people, that because it's been such a long-standing tradition, it's developed certain forms, practices, which become part of that tradition. And this includes some rites and rituals. And I know that people in the West, I certainly had some doubts about it when I first came across Buddhism, couldn't quite work out what these rites and rituals were all about. Well, it's just conventional forms. You know, if we travel around the world or meet people from other parts of the world, we know that different cultures, different people have different ways of greeting each other, saying farewell to each other. They have different forms of celebrating significant events such as births or deaths or marriages. And they're very sort of culture specific, but they're really ways in which human beings, and we're all social beings, social animals, find ways of collectively celebrating events that are significant to us. And of course, Buddhism has also developed the developed in a similar way, insofar as it also has developed certain rites and rituals. Now, the Theravadin tradition is really quite an interesting one because of the very earliest forms that the tradition took soon after the Buddha's death. This is the only one that survived. There were several others. Sarasthavadins comes to mind. There are some other ones as well, which I don't remember. And they have basically maintained a continuous tradition, continuous transmission. And for better or worse, their policy was just to stick with the original teachings of the Buddha and put them into practice following the Vinaya, which is the rules, the disciplines, the guidelines that he left for the monastic community, and sticking to it quite closely. which makes it a very conservative tradition. It doesn't sort of really look much for innovation. And of course, it spread from India into Southeast Asia and can now be found in countries such as Cambodia, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, I think I've mentioned that. And one very significant place, of course, is Sri Lanka, which for many years was the sort of home of Theravadin Buddhism as Buddhism died out in India, where it originally arose. Now, the tradition that this evening class largely represents in terms of the monastic tradition is the Thai forest tradition. And that in itself is really quite interesting because it's very much experience-based. It's not a scholastic tradition. So although there is knowledge of the scriptures, of the traditional texts that have been passed down from generation to generation, essentially it's a meditation-based tradition. Meditation as in not just learning to calm the mind, but also this process of inquiry that I referred to at the beginning when I started speaking. So, and being experiential, it means it has a life to it, which is why I think it attracted so many fine Western minds who went to Thailand in the middle of the last century or a little bit after and started ordaining in the tradition. And there are many great teachers, forest tradition teachers in Thailand. And the one that this particular class is associated with is largely the Ajahn Chah tradition. Ajahn Chah being a very renowned meditation teacher whose teachings influenced many, many individuals, amongst them Ajahn Sumedho, who came to England and set up more than one monastery, actually. He started off with one little vihara in Hampstead, and then moved to Chithurst, and then Amaravati was set up. So if you're not familiar with Amaravati or Chithurst or some of the other branch monasteries, such as Harnham and Hartridge, it's worth a visit. When COVID is over and we can visit monasteries, it's really interesting to visit a community which lives by the rules and regulations, as it were, the guidelines that the Buddha established, and yet at the same time meet people who are articulate, friendly, open-minded, open-hearted, and very welcoming, and are themselves on the path of personal individual inquiry. So hopefully that gives some context to the class and gives some context to the tradition that this class is associated with. This evening, it's me teaching the class or leading, facilitating the class. I prefer to see it as a facilitation rather than a formal teaching. But we are visited occasionally by nuns from Amaravati and elsewhere in this tradition. Ajahn Chandasiri and Ajahn Sundara are the main teachers who come. And in next week, the 7th, the week after, 2 weeks' time, we have Ajahn Sundara coming to teach this class. So you will get it, as it were, from the horse's mouth, direct teaching from a monastic. I think I'll say a little bit more about lay practice. You know, we live in a very challenging environment, certainly today. We are exposed to so many points of view, so many perspectives on life. We have a rampant social media. We have very active conventional media as well, all of which shouting in one way or another for our attention, wanting us to follow their particular channel or stream of information. And it can get very confusing being a layperson, looking for meaning, looking for truth, looking for some sort of fixed reference point which they can trust. And the beautiful thing about a tradition such as Buddhism is that, as I said, it encourages inquiry. At the same time, it really does offer what certainly I experienced, and I suspect many of you have experienced, has a very sound, sort of emotionally sensible approach, one which is very considerate, respectful, and never imposing. And it's certainly that open-mindedness and open-heartedness that attracted my attention when I came across Amaravati some over 30 years ago now. I'd been in several other Buddhist traditions which I found most inspiring, but there was something about the specific quality of Amaravati and the teachings there of Ajahn Chah that really grabbed my attention and resulted in me attending many, many retreats and resulted in me being here, for instance, sharing what little I know and understand. Having been a seeker myself and having been very lost in life in my early years, desperate to try and make sense and meaning of what appeared to be a very confusing world, I can personally vouch for the value of, at some point, committing to something which had a sense about it of offering more than I was fully aware of, encouraging what the Buddha was pointing to, which is an awakened state of mind. I think it's useful to remember that when using the word mind in a Buddhist context, we're also talking about the heart. The separation that we have in the West between the mind and the heart isn't so evident in Eastern thought, certainly not in Buddhist thought. They're seen as very, very interconnected. So every time you hear the word mind or heart, just add on the opposite word. So if one has the word heart, it also means mind with a capital M. And if one says mind, it also means heart with a capital H. The Buddhist philosophical traditional Buddhist psychology certainly acknowledges that we'd also have perhaps a mind with a small m, the thinking mind, which is one of our senses in the Buddhist tradition, because their classification of the senses is slightly different to ours. Apart from the 5 basic senses that we all have, of eyes, ears, nose, taste, and touch, they also see the mind, the thinking mind, as being a sense where a thought comes and we have this capacity to recognize a thought and sense a thought, experience a thought. So it's seen as a 6th sense. So in Buddhism, certainly in the Theravadin tradition, there are basic 6 senses which we relate to. So I thought it might be good, being a Theravadin class, to do a little bit of chanting. This chanting is completely optional. Wendy, who is kindly supporting our class this evening, will do a screen share and will show us a dedication of offerings, which I think is coming online as we speak. I'd like to say, apart from being completely optional, it's also interesting to read some of the words, some of which are very devotional and might feel a bit strange to a Westerner to express one's emotions. But what I have found is that as one gets more involved and starts experiencing the fruits of practice, one does start developing a very positive emotional relationship with the tradition. At the same time, maintaining great clarity about the fact that everything is transient, mental states are transient, emotions are transient, and this is just a conducive way of generating not only an open mind on the thinking level, conceptual level, but also an open heart, because we're talking about the transformation, a transformational process, where we move from a position of seeing ourselves as separate to a position where we see ourselves being part of a much, much bigger complex system, which ultimately actually includes the whole cosmos, the whole universe. And that realization can actually be psychologically and emotionally very reassuring and comforting. So what I'll suggest, I will light the candle behind me on the shrine that you can see, and we will chant the dedication of offerings. And I thought we'd do it both in Pali, in acknowledgement and recognition of the tradition, which dates back over 2,500 years. And we'll also do it in English, so we have a translation, which we can think about, accept, reject, or just put a question mark over, depending on our individual disposition. And just to say, after we've done the chanting, we will have, we'll take the 3 refuges and precepts. 3 refuges, very briefly, are essentially taking refuge in the principle of an awakened mind, this potential capacity that we have to recognizing what is real, what is true, the way things are. And not just recognizing it, but actually acknowledging it with our whole being. An awakened state of mind is an enlightened state of mind, one which knows what ignorance is and knows what true wisdom is. So we take refuge in the Buddha, who represents and symbolizes that quality of knowing. We'll also take refuge in the Dhamma, which is essentially taking refuge in the way things are, not based on like or dislike, but just the whole package as it exists, and taking refuge in virtue, which is taking refuge in the Sangha, which means a life built or lived in a field of ethics and morality, where there is respect for others and for oneself, respect for truth, and loving kindness, or an empathetic relationship with all beings. So we'll take the 3 refuges, which is like a commitment to certain principles, and then we'll also take the 5 precepts, or determine the 5 precepts, which are spelling out our commitment to harmlessness, commitment to respect for other people and property, respect for other individuals in our sexual activities or behavior, respect for truth and the use of our language, and respect for our minds and bodies in not consuming intoxicating drink or drugs which affect consciousness or clarity of understanding. So we'll take those 3 refuges and 5 precepts after we've done the dedication of offerings. So if you have a book and you're not using the screen, as you can see, it's on page 2. Generally speaking, we also, apart from lighting a candle, light some incense, but I'm a bit allergic to incense, so I'm not going to light it. But you'll see that there's a candle representing light and truth. There are some flowers which represent impermanence, beauty, and the transient nature of beauty and life. And the incense stick, if it was burning, would be representing how the truth can be dispersed through large spaces and reach many, many people. Yoso Bhagava Araham Samma Sambuddho. To the Blessed One, the Lord, who fully attained perfect enlightenment. Swakato yena bhagavata dhammo. To the teaching which he expounded so well. Sukatipanno yasa bhagavato sāvaka sangho. and to the Blessed One's disciples who have practiced well. Tamayam Bhagavantam Sadamam Sasangham. To these the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, Imehi Sakare Hiyataraham Aropitehi Apipu Chayama. We render with offerings our rightful homage. Sadhu no bante bhagava suchira parini putopi. It is well for us that the Blessed One, having attained liberation, Pachima Janata Nukam Pamanasa, still had compassion for later generations. Ime sakare dugatapana karabhute patikan hatu. May these simple offerings be accepted. Amhakam digaratam hitaya sukhaya, for our long-lasting benefit and for the happiness it gives us. Araham Samma Sambuddho Bhagava, the Lord, the perfectly enlightened and blessed one, Buddham Bhagavantam Abhivademi. I render homage to the Buddha, the Blessed One. Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo, the teaching so completely explained by him. Dhammam Namasami, I bow to the Dhamma. Supatipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho, the Blessed One's disciples who have practiced well. Sangham Namami, I bow to the Sangha. Andamayam Buddhasa Bhagavato Puvabhaganamakaram Karamase. Now let us pay preliminary homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the blessed, noble, and perfectly enlightened one. Homage to the blessed, noble, and perfectly enlightened one. Homage to the blessed, noble, and perfectly enlightened one. And we'll now go to page 128. We'll go to the third paragraph of Buddham Saranam Gacchami. And we'll just chant it in Pali this time. No, chant it in Pali and in English, that'll be good. Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami. To the Buddha, I go for refuge. To the Dhamma, I go for refuge. To the Sangha, I go for refuge. Dutiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dutiyampi Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Dutiyampi Sangham Saranam Gacchami. For the second time to the Buddha, I go for refuge. For the second time to the Dhamma, I go for refuge. For the second time to the Sangha, I go for refuge. Tatiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Tatiyampi Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Tatiyampi Sangham Saranam Gacchami. For the third time to the Buddha, I go for refuge. For the third time to the Dhamma, I go for refuge. For the third time to the Sangha, I go for refuge. And then we'll go to the 5 precepts, a little bit lower down on page 129. Panatipata Vyarimani Sikhapadam Samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from taking the life of any living creature. Adinadana Vyarimani Sikhapadam Samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from taking that which is not given. Kamesu me chachara Vyarimani Sikhapadam Samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from sexual misconduct. Musavada Vyarimani Sikhapadam Samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from lying. Surameraya Majja Pamadatana Vyarimani Sikhapadam Samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from consuming intoxicating drink and drugs which lead to carelessness. Imani pancha sikhapadani silena sugatim yanti, silena bhogasampada, silena nibutim yanti, tasma silam visodaye. These are the 5 precepts. Virtue is the source of happiness. Virtue is the source of true wealth. Virtue is the source of peacefulness. Therefore, let virtue be purified. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you. If one is new to the tradition and unfamiliar with the whole chanting process, that's quite understandable. It's something that only comes with exposure, with practice. Sometimes the words are less important than actually the chanting itself. When we produce a sound which has some kind of tune to it, even if it is a repetitive 2-tone tune, it does something. It's seen as a support to meditation practice. It's integrating. We know that when we listen to music, that both the hemispheres are engaged and involved. And if we chant collectively, that has an effect on our physical sense, on the way we feel in the body. So a little bit, if you're celebrating someone's anniversary and you sing happy birthday together, there's a collective sense of connection which loosens this sense of separation that we often feel with our environment. Very sort of simpler example might be being part of a football crowd, or if you're a tennis fan, chanting or cheering with a group of people, we know does something to our collective sense of togetherness. And here the sense of collective togetherness is as an encouragement to, as it were, reinforce a sense of harmony, togetherness, which in turn, of course, calms the heart, allows us to feel more present, which sort of leads us in nicely into sitting practice, formal meditation. We call it formal because we sort of allocate a time. The principle in meditation actually applies to everyday life. It's about cultivating present moment awareness. And this awareness isn't just a mental activity. It's about being conscious of the whole of our being. mind and body. It's important not to see it as an imposition, but a decision to relinquish what other activities we might be wanting to do, whether it be reading the newspaper, watching television, having a conversation, and noticing how it is to be in a body. So our attention, instead of being directed outwards, is directed inwards. And to help find that settled sense of well-being that we can experience in meditation, we bring our attention to the body and notice our sensations, the sensations of the body. And we try and do that in a posture that is conducive to comfort. Not the sort of comfort that you need to fall asleep, but comfort which also is energizing. So it's a relaxed, energizing posture. So if you're sitting on a cushion on the floor, or sitting on a chair, it's good, if possible, to have an upright back, so that the spine feels slightly elongated, not rigid, not forced, but not too relaxed either, so that you collapse. So the spine is like an upright posture. And once the upright posture is found and felt to be comfortable, the head positioned immediately at the top of the spine, shoulders can relax, chest can be open enough to feel the sense of openness and allow the air to enter with the in-breath and exhale with the out-breath. If you're sitting in a sofa, it might be tempting to lean back. In fact, it may be the only posture you can take. Well, then do what you can to sort of maintain an upright posture. And it can be very helpful just to take 3 or so deeper in-breaths, breathing out and exhaling, and just pausing for a second or two on the out-breath. It's very relaxing. It triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, which is a sort of regenerative mode or state of body physiology to be in. And notice the flow of air through the heart region into the lungs, pressing down on the diaphragm, which in turn pushes the belly out a little bit, so that you're breathing from the belly. So take 3 deeper in-breaths, longer out-breaths with a pause at the end, and then allow the breathing to find its own rhythm. Noticing the air entering the nostrils, and one in-breath through the windpipe, through the heart region, and into the lungs. It's like a wave, the swell of the ocean, breathing in and breathing out. In most cases, this happens quite automatically, quite naturally. And with each out-breath, just feeling the energy go lower, settling, like a discharge with each out-breath, recharge with each in-breath. Every now and then you might find the body quite naturally will take a slightly deeper in-breath, And notice how relaxing that in and longer out breath is. As we relax, the body breathes that way quite automatically. The eyes can be slightly open if you're feeling sleepy and tired, had a stressful day. And if you do have your eyes slightly open, you can point your eyes in a direction about 1 meter or so in front of you, but don't look at a specific point, just look into space in that direction, so that your awareness is still on the body, on the breathing, and not getting caught up in what you might be looking at. Sometimes you don't focus on the carpet or the floor. Just look in that direction, into space. Otherwise, closing the eyes is fine. It can help us pay attention to the actual experience of the breath. Hopefully your environment is not too noisy. You might notice the sense of silence, that sort of background white noise that we hear when we're not listening to any particular loud sounds. Noticing the weight of the body on your sitting bones, the legs, thighs, knees. Shins and calves, all the way down to the soles of the feet. You have your hands cupped, one in the other, or you can have a hand on each knee. We've all seen enough pictures of the Buddha sitting in different postures. And the simplest one is hands together or a hand on each knee. And the object of meditation, the reference point that brings us back to the present moment, can be our breath, the in-breath and the out-breath. And even as we breathe in and breathe out, we can notice any points of tension around the forehead, the eyes, the mouth. If you feel any tension there, you can scrunch your face up and then just allow it to relax, just to realize that it's not a fixed state there, that it can actually relax. Same with any part of the body. And we'll do this for about 20 minutes. Occasionally say a word or two, but we'll sit in silence most of the time. If the mind wanders off on some theme, some narrative, some issue, just notice that, and then guide the attention back to the body and the breath. Our state of mind is one of acceptance of this moment, just as it is. We're not trying to change how we feel. We just allow that change to happen naturally. We just create conditions for that change to take place. What we're doing is cultivating present moment awareness, which can be a constant. Awareness can only be present now. Our feelings, our emotions, our states of mind, they all come and go, they're always changing. So, if we've had some difficult moments today, which has left us feeling in a certain way, we just notice that and just say to ourselves, right now it's just like this, whilst breathing in and breathing out. Whatever happened, happened. It's history. And the future hasn't happened yet. So there's no point in fretting about what might be tomorrow. We're here and now. So we take refuge in the here and now. We take refuge in our awareness of the here and now. And allow the body and mind to relax into that sense of presence. being in the here and now allows us to experience the pleasure of not having to be anybody, do anything, be anywhere else except here, in the present moment. The beauty of the breath as an object of meditation is that it's always there. As long as we're alive, we're breathing. Unless we're ill, breathing is automatic and quite effortless. The signal of life, sign of life. So we notice that smooth flow of air through the nostrils, windpipe, heart region, into the lungs. And the natural, relaxing exhalation that follows. Like an ocean swell, it rises and falls. Breathing in and breathing out. Inhalation, momentary pause at the end of the inhalation, followed by the natural flow of the exhalation. being with the flow. Noticing any points of tension in the body, whether it be the head or the shoulders or the arms or the heart region or the tummy. As we breathe in and breathe out, we breathe in and breathe out through that part so that we relax, allow that part to relax. Letting go of the tension, not holding on to it. Letting the tummy line relax. There might be a corresponding emotional release, an emotion perhaps. You just breathe in and breathe out through that as well. Just letting any tension that's there to dissipate. No force, no pressure, no stress, no tension. Just being patient with a poor body that has to suffer so much stress. Giving it permission to unwind in its own time. No hurry. Opening the eyes slowly. Taking in the space that we happen to be sitting in. Noticing the walls enclosing the space. Noticing the objects in the room, their solidity, textures, different colors, and most importantly, noticing our state of mind. Having started relatively quietly and hopefully peacefully, just noticing how that impacts on our sense of well-being. Recognizing that in most cases it has a calming effect. Which is, of course, one aspect of meditation, is to help calm the mind stroke heart. And as the mind calms down, heart calms down, the process of integration takes place. We feel more together, we feel more present. The other aspect, of course, of meditation is developing understanding, which is the more reflective, contemplative side. But when we're agitated or distressed, we don't, generally speaking, think or reflect very clearly. Our ability to discern is compromised, it's affected by disturbance, by agitation. One can get very prescriptive with meditation. I'm doing calming or samatha meditation, as it's called, or I'm doing vipassana meditation. One can get caught up in trying to achieve a particular state of mind, a particular type of meditation, and one becomes a prisoner of an ideal and an objective of some kind. But if we observe how our minds work and bodies, we see that actually the two are often interwoven. Because we spend so much time thinking, operating from the head, a lot of the bias is towards thinking about things all of the time. So, sitting, calming meditation is the great antidote. It can be immensely helpful skill to develop, a counterbalance to all the thinking and worrying that we do. It actually gives permission for our thinking mind to sort of let go. Not just thinking mind, even our emotional mind. Letting go of all the preoccupations we may be caught up in life, in everyday life. The vast majority of us are in one type of relationship or other with somebody, if not more than one person. And if we observe the contents of our thinking, the contents of our awareness is usually thinking about things that we could have done, should have done, or did, that we might have regrets about, or disappointments from. So we're preoccupied with our history, our past. survival mechanisms as a human being is to anticipate the future. So we keep on going into the future and imagining future scenarios. There might be a lot of worries about the future. And I think it's helpful to remember that we're living in times where collectively, as a nation, as a planet, we're caught up in very anxious states of mind. This little virus is impacting on so many levels. It's disrupting our whole social order, the way we relate to one another. Many of us are having to isolate or keep limited contact, limit our contact with family, friends. The normal dramas of life are all amplified. We might be missing hospital appointments, having to have telephone appointments. We might be in need of treatment of some kind and unable to get it. And this is, of course, immensely distressing. It's one thing not to be able to meet up with friends, but it's another thing to be ill and not have access to the medical care that we would like to have. When suffering of the body suddenly makes a demand, and we feel we've got to do something and we can't do what we would normally do. So one could be quite cynical and say, well, how can meditation help me get my medical treatment? Meditation won't get you necessarily the medical treatment, but it might allow some calmer thinking. It might help us disassociate from our illness to give us a bit of respite from it. It's worth remembering there's a difference between dissociation and disassociation. Disassociation is a conscious directing of attention away from a particular issue or problem. Something that we can do as meditators. The Buddha did it himself when he was in physical pain, certainly when he was growing older. The Parinibbana Sutta, one of the last suttas, which is to do with his death, with his passing into Parinibbana, he spoke of the suffering that he experienced with his body. And that the only release he had from the pain of the body was by going into a meditative state, where he disassociated from the pain. A sort of natural anesthetic, analgesic if anything. Just basically, with his power of meditation practice, he was able to disassociate from the pain and get some relief. One of the truths that Buddhism points to is the fact that we suffer. We can't avoid physical suffering. Physical suffering is inherent in having a physical form which has senses. We all have senses. Nervous system to record pain and discomfort. So when we're ill or unwell or old, we feel the body as a body of pain. It's also helpful to remember that even our mental states, when we're in a distressed mental state, we feel it in the body. We can do something with our mind. We can develop insight with our mind, which accepts the inevitability of pain. Not to make us helpless and incapacitated, but the way we respond to the circumstances we find ourselves in affects the way we experience those circumstances. We have to accept that a body in pain is a body in pain. We can try and fight it, but fighting the pain often doesn't help. If we can take medication, then that helps, of course. But the key thing is to actually accept that pain is a part of life, and that's like an emotional acceptance. So that's something which happens within us. So cultivating acceptance of discomfort is a preparation for the pain that we might experience when we grow ill or old. So where do we find freedom from suffering? Well, paradoxically, by accepting that suffering is a part of life. It's one of the characteristics of existence. There are three sort of key characteristics in the Buddhist framework of reference of life. One is suffering, or dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness of existence, where things that are pleasing, that we get attached to, change. Everything is changing. In fact, that's the second characteristic of existence, is anicca, or change, uncertainty. A lot of our time is spent giving ourselves a sense of security, trying to give ourselves certainty, protection from the elements, protection from the threats of life, of living in a complex society. But life is uncertain. We can't guarantee our safety, our security. It is not a teaching to encourage fear or worry or anxiety. Quite the opposite, is actually pointing that if we accept that as a given, we can learn to live with it in a way that still leaves us skillful, doesn't prevent us from avoiding dangers. Quite the opposite. It allows us to notice more and take the precautions that we can take and accept that they may not be perfect. And the third characteristic of existence, which is the one which really has enormous significance when realized, is the principle of Anata, that we're caught up in an impersonal process. We take it very personally because we have personalities, we have a sense of identity. We identify with our bodies. But life is essentially impersonal, it's a process. And this process is referred to as Dhamma, the way things are, reality. At the end of the day, reality always wins. The way things are always wins. The question is, can we be attuned and in harmony with reality? A very magical thing happens when we live in accordance with Dhamma or in harmony with reality. We actually suffer less. It's one of those paradoxes. That in accepting impermanence, in accepting the unsatisfactoriness of life, we become more realistic, and becoming more realistic and accepting, we actually find peace. We realize that we can't find peace in conditions which are always changing. So all the Buddha's teachings and the teachings of all great spiritual masters is to point to that which we can identify, recognize, and be one within ourselves, which is our awareness, our consciousness. our ability to be present. But being present in a way that doesn't over-identify, where we don't hold on to the objects that we are aware of, whether they be mental objects or emotional objects or physical objects. So we find refuge and peace in an unconditioned perspective on life. And we all have access to that. Not as some dream in the future that one day I will wake up. Well, it's true that one day we may wake up, but what are we waking up to? We're waking up to what we already are and what we already have access to. Awareness is here and now, nowhere else. Right now, as we're sitting, each one of us is aware of whatever we're aware of. The contents for each one of us will be unique and specific to ourselves. We each have our body with its thinking, feeling, sensing capacity, and it's quite unique. What we all have in common at the moment, as we're sitting here, connected by the strange medium of modern technology, is that we're all aware. Our awareness is no different from one person to another. The awareness consciousness is the same. What is different, of course, are the contents of our consciousness. Whether we're male, female, old, young, smart, stupid, attractive, beautiful, not so beautiful. That's just the contents of our awareness. But our present moment awareness is here, and it's always now, without exception. All of history, our history, individual personal history, world history, is always happening in the present moment. We have a concept of time because we measure change. We see how objects change, but all those objects of our awareness are changing in a timeless present moment. And the paradox of this change is that we can change in this timeless moment by realizing the unconditioned nature of the mind with a capital M. We find freedom in our awareness and not the contents of our awareness. That's where we find freedom from suffering. But this waking up process is not just an intellectual understanding. It's actually experienced as a direct affect changing realization where mind and body, feeling and thought come together in a waking up moment. And that's essentially what all Buddhist practice is ultimately about. It's what the Buddha went in search of when he walked away from his home, his family, his parents, his son and wife. And having woken up to this universal truth, he spent the rest of his life sharing his understanding with those who are interested. And that's really the heart of practice, is this heartfelt inquiry. What is this all about? Who am I? Where is all this going? Where do I come from? These are sort of key existential questions which are really worth asking. And the Buddhist tradition is full of injunctions and pointers and helpful formulas and teachings to help us find a way out of this labyrinth of worry, fear, anxiety, speculative thought, opinions and views. And his formula was very simple, is to be present in the moment, observe what we experience in the moment, observe how we react, how we respond to what we experience. And one of the foundations on which this insight practice is built is how we relate to others. So the 5 precepts that we took at the beginning of this evening's session are just a declaration, a determination to live by certain moral, ethical standards. Why? Because they're conducive to truth, to peace, to harmony. Why? Because they are based on truth. They're based on the truth of other people's existence. They're based on respect for other people. And they also encourage harmonious, friendly, respectful disposition to other people. What does that do? What's the effect of living a life on those lines? Peace, avoidance of conflict. All of us have tried one way or another at some point in our lives to be perhaps untruthful, to might be tempted to take what doesn't really belong to us. And most of us, vast majority of us, have a sense of conscience, a sense, it doesn't feel right. We sort of know it's not the right thing to do. So instead of just going by that, don't think I like this very much, it's a declare it. It's not nice to harm other people. We're affected when we harm other people, ourselves. If we take things that don't belong to us, we feel guilty. It's not the right thing to do. This is partly conditioned by our social conditioning, but it also puts us in potential conflict if we take something that doesn't belong to us. And conflict is stress. So we minimize the stress by not hurting other people, not taking advantage of them, not taking things from them that don't belong to us. The 3rd precept about sexual misconduct is about being respectful of other people's bodies, not using other bodies as objects. They're actually physical forms which have feelings and emotions and sensitivities, so it's being respectful of them. And each one of us will have our own criteria as to what's respectful, but it's worth exploring. It's just a sort of reference point to think of. Our communication with other people, is it truthful? When we tell a lie, we might gain some advantage, but how long-term is that advantage? What are the consequences of being untruthful or of gossiping or speaking behind other people's backs in ways that are harmful? And then, of course, how do we treat our minds? Do we drink alcohol? Do we take drugs? Well, we might have some temporary relief or respite from our anxieties, our fears. We might forget about the world. We might forget about COVID-19 momentarily. But if we drunk alcohol, we know that we get headaches. Our decisions are clouded, not very skillful. All sorts of things happen when we're under the influence of whatever substance we might be taking or trying. So these are just basic building blocks of everyday life, which it's really worth paying attention to. So if we are on a sincere path of inquiry, meditative inquiry, the way we lead our lives will have a great bearing on the outcomes of our search for meaning, search for truth. So, I'm aware that I've been speaking longer than I planned. As you may have gathered, there's a topic close to my heart. I find these questions really, I was going to say all-consuming, but certainly central to living. So if you'd like to ask a question, we probably might run a little bit over time. I was saying that I wouldn't, but I wouldn't like to just end without hearing maybe some feedback. If anybody has a question they'd like to ask, I don't know if we can be unmuted, or you unmute yourself individually, and do feel free to ask a question. As I said at the beginning, it's very strange talking to a silent room with just an image of myself, which I'm trying not to get too caught up in. A bit distracting. But do feel free, if anybody has a question, do feel free to ask. Remembering that whatever question you ask is often a question which might be being asked by somebody else but not voiced. I don't know if we've got gallery view. If we've got gallery view. Yeah, got gallery view. Would anybody like to ask a question or have a point they'd like to make or share with the rest of the group? I don't know how many participants we've got, but yeah, we have 35 participants, so someone there might have a question or a point to make.
Can I ask one? Mariano here. And the question is, some of us are obviously, living in seclusion almost these days and got to keep breathing, what helps in the Buddhist practice to keep the energy going?
Well, I mean, some very practical things come to mind. I think keeping in touch with people we know. The amazing thing about this form of communication is that we can actually be in touch with quite a few people. I'd make it a point of having a conversation with a friend or family member on a regular basis. And I really would use something such as FaceTime or Zoom or some platform or other where you can actually see the other person, because it triggers all sorts of associations that makes the person much more real, even though they're just an image on the screen. The fact is we're so socially conditioned that we get cued, we get triggered into responding much more engagingly in a face-to-face than we do just over the telephone. We can do it over the telephone, of course. So I think it's important to stay in touch, especially with people who don't stress you out. You might be in relation. But keeping in touch with people who might be feeling lonely. Some people do struggle in these times. And it's nice to offer a gesture of interest and just find out how are you managing, how are you coping. The thing to watch, of course, is to get caught up in running negative commentary on the state of the world or politics when it's just sort of talking about how awful things are. It'd be nice to make sure that if you are having a conversation with somebody that you talk about some of the good things that are happening. If you've got a garden, you can talk about what's happening in your garden. Lots that's happening in the garden. Squirrels are busy feeding, getting food where they can in order to bulk themselves up for the winter. Birds are also eating as much as they can. Cats are wandering around looking for food. There's a lot happening in the garden. I was looking at the garden this afternoon and just noticing how so many leaves have fallen and suddenly it is winter here. So I think keeping in touch with friends is important. I think going for a walk if you can every day, I think I mentioned this last time, really staying in touch with the outside world on a physical level is really important. Otherwise we live in our heads And the fact is that walking outside, we're exposed to a lot more light, ultraviolet light. It brightens the brain. And just the act of walking itself physically is actually a very balancing, very, very grounding practice. We do it formally, of course, in our meditation practice, but walking is very healthy. A lot of wonderful thoughts can get thought when we walk. It does something to our brain and our cognitive functioning. And then I think I've mentioned this before, you know, eating food that isn't too heavy. If we're at home a lot, you know, we're probably, a lot of us are eating more food than we need to in terms of energy expenditure. And if we eat heavy sort of sweet, sort of a lot of carbohydrates, it actually burdens the body and doesn't help us feel good. So I think trying to put some discipline in place about not eating too much or too frequently, I think that these are the physical things that we can do. And I think having a practice of some kind, whether it be yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, and of course meditation practice, you know, that really, for me, is almost a key. Starting the day with some meditation practice. If you really struggle with your meditation practice, even 5 or 10 minutes, just to get into that habit of sitting down and just being with however it is, not expecting a meditation to be wonderful, calming and soothing and reinvigorating. Sometimes meditations can be quite discomforting. They can give rise to all sorts of emotions which come to the surface. And if they do, to work it out, you know, as I say, through exercise or through reflection, reading the right sort of material, not watching too much TV. You know, I think there are things that we can take care of. So those are the things that come to mind. But thank you for raising it. It's very important just to reiterate and remind ourselves of what we can do to help ourselves feel better. And also, of course, apply the principles, you know. Anicca, impermanence, means everything is impermanent. Even this current state of affairs is not going to be forever. Yeah. And that's really helpful to know. Observe how the thought about how awful things are is a thought, you know, and how it can weigh down on us if we invest too much into it. Thoughts come and go. COVID will come, is here, and will eventually go. So I think it's just good to remind ourselves of the sort of frame of reference which an amazing philosophy and teaching, such as the Buddhist teaching, can offer us in dealing with situations of stress.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question.
Hi, Nick. It's Imogen.
Hi. Yes, hello. Yes, just seeing you. Yeah.
I'm afraid I haven't got
Sorry, I can hear.
a proposal for what this might be, but it occurred to me that if we were meeting in person, and I know we've talked before about the ability to have time afterwards where people stay on. Mm-hmm. But if we're meeting in person, different conversations would spring up perhaps as people were leaving the building, and there might be people you feel you've had a good conversation with, or you're able to sort of connect with in some way. And I don't know how it would work, but whether there's a way that either through the people, because we all come together and then we disappear and it's impossible to make any contact with people during the week, but whether there's some kind of way we're able to, I don't know, just put our names forward, just say, we're here, here's an email address, or here's something just within this group perhaps, because we share something each Monday that we don't share with anyone else and might be helpful.
Yeah, it's a really very good idea. You know, as you were mentioning the idea, the answer cropped up straight away. With permission and with the help of the Buddhist Society, we could go into breakout rooms after a session such as this. So those who want to leave, just leave the meeting completely. But if some breakout rooms were set up and maybe 5 or 4 or 6 people went into each breakout room, we could have a discussion, talk about the evening, talk about the theme of the evening. I think it's a brilliant idea, Richard. I really think it's worth pursuing. we may not be able to do it this evening because it would mean someone staying on probably, unless, well, as a co-host, I'd stay on actually and
can I say something?
just leave 20 or half an hour extra time for people to.
Can I suggest something in the meantime? There is the Mindfulness Association,
Yeah.
which is running classes at 7 every day, even in the morning they run it during the week, and they do these kind of things afterwards. It is a screen for Samye Ling anyway, so it is Buddhist in nature, even though it is secular on the surface. And they do exactly this kind of things every evening, different people leading it, and they seem to be good enough, expert. So in the meantime, until the Buddhist Society organizes something, there is always that one as well.
Yeah. The reason I like Imogen's suggestion, of course, because it's for a group that we have something in common with here.
Yeah. The other one is we can write on the chat our email address and then get in touch with each other and start something.
Well, we can. Yes.
Madeline bowing in. I think going into breakout rooms after such a meeting is just a wonderful idea, because we can build a relationship with each other. We've all been listening to this really important talk that you've given. I think what you talked about this evening is the key to freedom, and I think that it would be really lovely if we've all listened together and that we could all share our feelings about it and how we're actually putting it into practice. I think I have been practicing in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition, and sharing is one of the fundamental practices in that tradition, where we create an environment that's completely confidential and we share from the heart. And it's a practice of not only sharing, but also deep listening. And it's really very nourishing. So I would really very much like that sort of thing to follow on from such a group as this evening. And I think we would all really benefit from it.
Right.
Bowing out.
So let's ask Wendy, if you're online, if you can hear my question. Is that something, do you think, that we could organize to actually have some breakout groups? Or because at the moment there's about 32 of us at the moment, which is quite a high number, too much for one group, I think. At the same time, everybody can share. So there's sort of a plus side to it as well.
So Odin is here as well. So I think Odin will, if he hears what you said, I think he will speak.
Right, Odin. What are your thoughts, Odin? Oh, maybe he's not.
I got a technical suggestion to make, because we are doing it all the time. Without forcing the Buddhist Society people to stay on, they got families to go back to and so on. At the end of this session, one of us can trigger off, let's say, a meetgoogle.com, send the link in the chat, and everyone who wants to carry on for an hour or whatever it is can join in. And that is run by us. Yeah?
Well, the other way to do it, of course, is to...
no, I will speak to Odin.
Please. So I could end the meeting at the end when we've decided to so in our control. There's no need really for Odin or for Wendy. I've got a very bad signal for some reason. Could you say that again?
You're froze. As I said, I will speak to Odin. So maybe we can do some breakout rooms after the class. Not today. Maybe next week.
Right. Right.
So we have to set up the breakout room in the Zoom.
Okay.
So once we set up that, and after class, and if Odin thinks that it's okay to do in the breakout room, and then we can go to that room as well. But we have to set it up. We haven't set it up at the moment, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's do that. Imogen, thank you again for the suggestion. It's a great one. Yeah. Okay. So I thought we might end on with a chant.
Okay.
I had thought of the chant that we would do would be on page 37 on the Metta Sutta. It's a little bit longer than the another chant, but it's such a powerful chant that I thought we might do that. That's on page 37 of our books. But before we, yes, let's do that. Let's do that chant, the Buddha's words on loving kindness. I'd like to thank you all for your participation in this evening's session. And we'll end on the notes of the Buddha's words of loving kindness. This chant of loving kindness, this is what by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud and demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease, whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another, or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. And then we do the closing homage on page 16, which Wendy has kindly put up. Before we do the closing homage, I just wanted to say that it's been a good evening, and the suggestion is a great one. I think what we might do is make sure there's a little break as well, a little comfort break, because people might want to have a bit of a break, maybe 5-minute break before the breakout rooms. Anyhow, we'll give it some thought and put it in place. So the closing homage on page 16. If you have a shrine, you might want to turn to it. Araham Samma Sambuddho Bhagava, the Lord, the perfectly enlightened and blessed one, Buddham Bhagavantam Abhivademi, I render homage to the Buddha, the Blessed One. Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo, the teaching so completely explained by him, Dhammam namasami, I bow to the Dhamma. Supatipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho, the Blessed One's disciples who have practiced well. Sangham namami, I bow to the Sangha. So maybe we can just spend a few minutes saying goodbye to each other. Not quite a breakout room, but yes, a leaving breakout room.
Thank you
Anybody?
very much, Nick.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Anand.